going to recording. So go ahead and this will be a good chance to Maine, Oxford County, Maine, PA, New York, Tippecanoe County, my home county. Look at that. New Hampshire, Tioga County, good. PA, looks like we have some Hamilton County. Good Eastern U.S. connections. Okay, Minnesota, good. Idaho, I thought, Bob, you were from Idaho, good. That makes us cross-continental, doesn't it? Great, well, thank you all. We are currently being recorded, so this will allow us to, this will allow me to post the saved recording onto the website, so either you or other people who might be interested will be able to view this at some point in the future if you want some interest in doing that. So why don't we go ahead and get started. I'm rearranging some stuff here. I want to offer my thanks first of all to Cornell University Cooperative Extension, who made this technology available to us. And we have in front of us about an hour's presentation, give or take. Sometimes the questions run a little bit over, and I hope that you're able to stick around for as much of this as possible. Currently have 42 people subscribed. And I'll introduce myself. My name's Peter Smallidge. I work for Cornell University Cooperative Extension as the state extension forester, and this is the month are we in? We're in April, so we're almost about 11 months into using web conferencing technology. For those of you who are new to this, it's really easy to do. You've all seen and had a chance to practice a little bit with the chat pod. The other pod that I want you to get practice with is to do some real quick survey polls. You should collect 2 boxes on this, and this is one of the first 2 boxes, whether or not this is your first webcast, and one of the bottom 5 boxes to indicate, and the boxes are on the left-hand side of this chat pod, to indicate your previous participation with forestry workshops and seminars. So is this your first webcast, and how frequently do you attend in-person forestry workshops or seminars? So let's take, and these go really quickly. We spend about 20 seconds for each of these. And it gives me a good sense of the audience that I'm working with. I also use these are really powerful data that I can use with my administrators to help prove to them and reinforce with them they know that this is useful technology, but it makes them feel better about what they're doing and how they're doing it. Okay, we'll give another couple of seconds on this poll, and then we'll have one other poll. Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, we close that poll, put it away, bring out the other one. It's even easier for you to respond to. It's just the number of acres that you're working with. Take a couple seconds to check on this, please. Okay, we're 31 out of 45 people responded. If we could get a few more of you to sign in, please. It's quick, it's easy, it's painless, it's helpful. And we'll get started. Okay, last call, going once. Closing that poll, and we'll get started. All right, so today we're going to be talking about a landowner's approach, if you will, to selecting trees for forest improvement. And A lot of this will emphasize forest improvement for timber objectives, but it's quite easy and simple to translate the techniques that we're talking about, the principles that we're talking about, to forest improvement for any number of landowner objectives. So what I hope you learn from this today, overall, what we're really talking about is growing healthy trees, and because of their health, these trees will make you feel good about your forest. Specifically, I'm wanting to be able to show you how your particular objectives relate to the selection of trees, the factors to consider when you're selecting trees to cut versus leave, and strategies to remove unwanted trees. So the actual nuts and bolts of how do you make these trees do what you want them to do. So the obvious first question is, why do we want to worry about growing healthy trees? And the simple one-line answer to that is, by having healthy trees, you're going to accomplish your particular goals sooner and with greater control. And that's those are not trivial objectives to have. We all have just a certain amount of time, and everybody has takes some pleasure in rate of gratification. And if we can own forest land and we pay taxes on forest land, and it's nice when we have an objective on our forest land that comes about sooner rather than later. Now, these aren't going to be light years faster, but if you can accomplish your objectives over the span of a few years or a decade or two versus having to wait several decades. And these goals may relate to any of the standard kinds of objectives: timber production, wildlife habitat, foods, aesthetics, and water quality. So these are all reasons why we'll want to have healthy trees. So what makes for healthy trees, and to continue related to the previous question about why grow healthy trees, the outputs that we want from trees, the tangible outputs that we want, whether it's timber production, whether it's a fruit that's going to feed a particular or group of wildlife species, whether it's the longevity of the trees, these tangible outputs require the trees to have adequate growth. Trees are unlike human beings. By the time you're an adult, most of us as adults are trying very hard to stop growing. Some of us have more success with that than others. Trees, on the other hand, need to have that continued growth. If the growth stagnates, they become less resilient, less able to defend themselves. The trees that are vigorously growing are better able to withstand challenges that face those trees. So by controlling the sunlight, and this is particularly true in the eastern U.S. and certainly in the northeastern U.S., sunlight is the environmental factor that most commonly limits tree growth. So by cutting trees, undesired trees, we free their neighbors from competition. And I'm showing two pictures on the screen. The picture on the left is showing a closed canopy in a sugar maple forest, and as you look up into that canopy, you can see the boundary line, this tension line between these two neighboring trees is truly a line of tension. The tree on the left the crown of that tree is compressed and is reduced in growth. Even this bigger tree on the right is having competition responding. So the contrast to that is when you go into this, on the picture on the right it's a different area, but it's illustrating a very aggressive thinning that would release these crowns from competition. So we'll be talking about, going from the picture on the left to the picture on the right. Here's an example of some of the good growth that can follow appropriate and production-oriented thinning. The picture in the upper left is a picture of a stump, a sugar maple stump. This is in Tompkins County, and I have a scale stick laying on this stump so that it shows that the stump is 15 inches in diameter. And when you zoom in on the picture, which I was able to do because I took the picture and I put the black lines on the slide to illustrate the last 10 years of growth. And so those 10 years of growth occurred over or produced 2 inches of growth on the radial increment. So that means in 10 years, this tree actually grew 4 inches in diameter. That's very good growth for sugar maple. And that happened because this particular sugar maple tree was on a private woodland owner's property that had been managed for timber production. Forest had been thinned 3 times over the preceding 25 years, always cutting the worst trees and leaving the best trees behind to respond favorably to that increase in growth. We can use an alternative illustration of a cross-section of a Norway spruce log. This was a tree that was cut during the thinning operation, and it illustrates the most recent 10 years of growth with a very short red bar and the previous 10 years of growth that occurred that produced maybe 3 times as much growth as the most recent 10 years. And what this illustrates is how when the spruce plantation was growing, you can see the thickness of the growth rings is an indication of the rate of growth. And for the first several years, this tree was growing quite well. But about 10 years ago, maybe 13 years ago, the canopy of the spruce plantation closed, the crowns came together, competition set in, growth was reduced for some of these trees. So what we're trying to do is to be able to manage the sunlight that's available to these trees. And a very important starting point when you think about forest improvement is an improvement has to be relative to something. You're improving it from its current condition and making it better for something else. The question then is, what is that something else that you're trying to improve it for? That something else has to be your objectives. And I'm showing here on the screen 4 different pictures of some very typical and very complementary ownership objectives. All of these ownership objectives are objectives that can be supported through forest improvements by making some judicious and deliberate cuts in your forest to concentrate. What we're trying to do is concentrate the growth on the best trees, and the best trees are those trees that support our ownership objective. The upper left-hand corner is a picture of fall color. Many people, have an aesthetic objective by having large, healthy trees and a variety of tree species that are surviving. We can have a variety of fall colors. The upper right-hand corner is a picture of acorns. If I remember correctly, this is a picture I borrowed. I say borrowed, I probably stole it from a colleague, Jim Finley, in Pennsylvania. The acorns are symbolic of foods that are produced by forest trees and enjoyed by wildlife. Lower left-hand corner, a picture of a log truck. Forest owners have an objective for timber production because of the revenue it produces. Maybe it's firewood production. And then the bottom right-hand corner is a forest owner who has a set of binoculars and is out looking for birds. These are all complementary objectives. The trees that are at the core of satisfying these ownership objectives do best if they're growing well. So all of these objectives can be supported through forest improvements, operations, and activities. What's most important is that the owner have a very clear and specific knowledge of what their objectives are and how to achieve those through improvement activities. So with that as kind of some background and some context, let's now jump into the nuts and bolts of what we're really trying to do is pick the winners and pick the losers. You're going to be making an investment of time, money, and sunlight. And if you think about this as an investment, even if your objective is not financially based, think about this in the same way that you would think about making an investment in something else. How are you going to spend your time? How are you going to spend your money? And where are you going to allocate the sunlight? That will help you when you get stuck on a question of should I cut a tree or should I leave a tree? And even what part of the forest should I work in? Where am I going to have my most positive and soonest response return on investment? There are several things that we're going to be talking about. We'll look at each of these factors specifically, we've already mentioned ownership objectives as they relate to soils, but we'll talk a little bit more about soils. We'll talk about the health of crowns. We'll talk about crown class. We'll look at how different species can mix together for different soil types, although we won't go into specific detail. We'll think about vigor and defect in trees, and we'll think about spacing. The picture that you see on the right is a picture from a forest owner who was the blue ribbon tree is a crop tree. This is a sugar maple. And this particular owner in this particular part of his property was trying to develop a sugar bush. So this owner was marking these trees for to retain the blue ribbon trees as crop trees, and he's marked this white ash tree with an orange ribbon indicating a tree that he plans to cut. So when I think about which trees to favor, which trees to retain, one of the most important characteristics is the health and vigor of the crown. The crown of the tree is the factory. That's where photosynthesis occurs. It's through photosynthesis that the trees are able to produce the starches, the carbohydrates that they need to survive. And so if you're going to make an investment of sunlight, you want to make an investment into a healthy production system. So that, if you can see the blue lines demarcating these two trees on the left, both of these trees are examples of good, healthy crowns. Now, there may be other factors that go into choosing whether or not you would keep both of these trees or not, but as a starting point, they both have nice, healthy crowns. That's in contrast to these two trees that have the crowns outlined in red. These trees have proven themselves as having relative to the length of their stem, a very poor, low vigor crown. So those would not be good places to make an investment. And I like to think, just keep this in mind, that the tree crown is the production factory. This is where the work happens. And if you were in business and you were making an investment in a company and you evaluated the production facilities, you're going to want to make your investment into a company that has a good potential to respond to your investment. So the trees that have the big crown, the best, the healthiest crowns, are those trees that are best able to respond to that investment. Another consideration is the relative height of the crown of an individual tree when compared to the neighboring trees. The trees that you want to favor to retain in your forest are those trees that have a crown in the upper canopy. In the top panel, these are the dominant trees in the dark blue, and then in the light blue, these are the trees that would have what's called the codominant crown class. These are trees that have demonstrated their ability to grow under the current existing conditions. There are other trees you'll see in the forest that are termed the intermediate trees, and these are the third panel, which you can see indicated, where they have just sunlight from the top. The vertical lines that you see are indications of sunlight. So here's a single strand of sunlight. Here these codominant trees are getting sunlight from the top and a little bit on the sides. The dominant trees have sunlight from the top and the sides. At the very bottom of the pecking order are the suppressed or the overtop trees that essentially don't get any sunlight. Now, this is how you compare one particular tree against the trees in its immediate vicinity. You can imagine that if all of the trees, let's say if you took these four dominant or codominant trees out, you would have a gap in the canopy, a quarter-acre gap or a half-acre gap or a 2-acre gap. The trees around the outside are going to be larger. The trees inside the gap, if they're part of another age class, a younger age class, you would make the comparison of crown classes within that particular age class. Typically what happens in our even-aged forests, which characterize most of the forests in the eastern U.S., all these trees that you see in this canopy profile are all about the same age. And what we've seen is the winners have already differentiated themselves from the losers. So we want to, again, we're making an investment. We want to place that investment on trees that have shown their potential for winning. In this case, for the crown classes, it's the dominant and the pro-dominant trees. When we think about soils, we need to have knowledge of the soils in the different areas of our forest and understand how one particular tree species, although it may have become established on that forest, is either favored or not favored on that particular. This is actually a picture from our property in the eastern Adirondacks. The picture on the left is a nice hardwood site. It's a sandy loam soil. It has a pretty good organic matter. This is a site where I'm going to be favoring faster growing, more demanding species that can take advantage of these higher soil resources. Sugar maples, red oaks. I don't usually favor beech, but it will grow well here, and white pine. The picture on the right is a picture of a very sandy soil. It's well drained. It's a soil that's better suited to coniferous species, particularly white pine and red pine. That's what dominate the site. There are some hardwoods there, but even though they've become established, those hardwoods don't necessarily perform well there. So when I'm making decisions about which to pick, which trees to leave, which trees to cut, I'll favor those trees that have the greatest potential to respond. On the better soils, the hardwoods are more demanding, and so I'll favor them on the best quality soils. I've illustrated or written up at the top of the panel two websites, and I have those set up as web links. And what I'm going to do is I'll click on those, and this will all happen in the background. I will click on these, and if the technology works correctly, then it will open these windows directly into your web server. So first one I'll open is the NRCS website, and it should open you up. You may need to click on your computer to come back to this presentation. The other website is called the gmushrooms.com, and this is a website that describes how certain species are matched with certain soils. So I'll open those up. You can those will stay running in the background of your computer, and you can come back to them later and review them and bookmark them if you want. So we're about 20 minutes or 25 minutes into the presentation. You all have very nicely contributed your locations where you're emailing in from or internet connected from. Could you all? I just want to make sure you know if you have questions, please feel free at any time to type in a question. If it's if it's a question as we're going through something, sometimes it's easier to deal with that sooner than later. If it's a long-winded question, or if it's a long-winded answer, really, or if it's a question that I'm going to answer later in the presentation, I'll hold it. Because we have this chat pod, we'll be able to scroll back and forth when we get to the end, and we'll make sure that we have all of the questions responded to. So please, at any time, feel free to jump in with questions. Okay, another consideration when we're picking trees to cut versus the trees to leave, these are examples of trees that would be good candidates to cut. Trees that are defective oftentimes have slower growth. They may have a large healthy crown, but their ability to utilize the resources of that crown, growing potential, isn't necessarily favorable. These are also trees that when an ice storm happens, these are the trees that are more likely to snap and break. When they snap and break, then they may fall and damage a desirable tree, a tree that's preferable to your ownership objectives. And they also have the potential to spread pathogens throughout your forest. Most of these, the four here the maple borer, the fusarium, the nectria, and the utapella are all pests and pathogens that are tend to be focused on sugar maple. Weak forks in trees are common in any particular species. Some of these, two of these, the maple borer and the fusarium, these two on the lower left-hand corner, are both organisms. The maple borer is an insect, fusarium is a fungus. Both of those are organisms that are enhanced in a forest that is overstocked. And an overstocked forest is one that has more trees than or is approaching the full carrying capacity of the forest. The nectria and the utapella cankers, these are organisms that are fairly common. They are going to exist irrespective of the density of the forest. Difference is that when you go in and thin, if you're making decisions to cut, you can reduce the abundance of those species. Okay. Another consideration we make when we're picking which trees to cut and which trees to leave deals with the spacing. It's in an ideal, if we simplify the growth of a forest and we think about how can we maximize the growth and production of that forest, we can think about agricultural settings where they have very, very rigid control over the spacing of plants. You think about the spacing of rows of corn, you think about the spacing of apple orchards or other kinds of fruit orchards, and you think about forest plantations where they go to great lengths to have control over the spacing. In a natural forest, such as you see in this picture, we will never attain the perfect spacing that will maximize production. But what we can do is influence the spacing by picking those trees. The crop tree in this particular picture is marked in yellow, and the cut trees, which you can see, which have this kind of pinkish paint. There's a second one. That's a forked white ash, and here's another white ash. This is illustrating, and this is, then you can't see it, but upslope is another crop tree. So the spacing, I'm trying to develop a spacing pattern between these crop trees. So spacing, it's not one of those things that I usually try and emphasize, but it's something that you want to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, we have a couple of questions here. Bob Ball is asking if it's reasonable to expect logger to remove defective trees during a commercial harvest. That depends on the contract that you have with a logger, and that's a good reason why it's important to work with the forester, or when whoever's marking the trees that are going to be cut during a commercial harvest, they need to know that you have an ownership objective to reduce the number of defective trees in the forest. So you talk to your forester. I usually recommend forest owners start off with a conversation with their state agency forester. Most state agency foresters, though, will not administer a commercial harvest. They can refer you to private sector foresters, consulting and industrial foresters who can provide the technical assistance that forest owners need. And I'll be giving some more comments about selecting foresters towards the end of the presentation. Bob asks, where is there literature dealing with soil components such as calcium? Which soil types they are found in? The G Mushrooms website that I sent you had some information on different soil characteristics and the trees that responded best on those particular soils. So it had examples of if you had a clay soil, which kinds of tree species would grow there. When you start asking about some of the specific soil components such as calcium, trying to think here, probably I would approach that from a particular tree perspective, and I'm going to suggest that you do a Google search use the words Silvix and Manual. This is a Forest Service publication. It's the actual title. It's the Silvix of trees of North America. And you can, if you're interested in how sugar maple or loblolly pine or ponderosa pine has certain kinds of needs from the soil, that's a good resource to do that. And I'm not real familiar with the NRCS soil website that I connected you to here just a minute ago. That may also have some of that information. So, right, it does not get into real specific detail. What kinds of specific details are you? Can you give me an example of the kind of specific detail you might be looking for? Well, while you're thinking about it, and I'll think about it too, and I may something may come to mind as we're moving along. So let's keep moving along, and we'll see where if that we can develop that question and discussion a little bit more fully. Um, I want to put a bit of a commercial in here to emphasize the importance of being safe. Ultimately, where you're going to want to go with the thinning, which trees to cut and which trees to leave, involves cutting some trees. Cutting trees is a um, is inherently a risky and dangerous effort. It can be done safely. Lots of people do it day in and day out, and they stay safe and they don't get hurt. But there are also situations where you need to know what you're able to accomplish, what your skill level is, and what you are not able to accomplish. The picture on the left is showing, actually, this is a picture from one of our research projects where we were working in sugar bushes and thinning in sugar bushes. And these we were selecting sugar bushes that had never been thinned. So these were very heavily stocked, dense forest stands. And the first few trees, trying to get them to come down into an opening is always a challenge. This particular tree is hung up, and the next step is how do you get this tree on the ground safely? The picture on the right is showing one of those trees that has a weak fork and what happens when you leave a tree that has an inherently weak fork, what can happen. If this is in your woodlot, my sincere recommendation is that you just walk away from this area, maybe put a special color of flagging ribbon on this tree to denote it as a hazard tree. Give it a week, give it a month, a little bit of wind, this tree will split out the rest of the way and will become stabilized. This is a dangerous tree, and unless there's some really compelling reason for you to try to cut that, it's not a tree that's worth getting injured. Okay, so Bob's question about for example, does hard maple grow better on a calcium soil or should it be growing red oak? This is good. Okay, glad that specific example helped me come up with a good answer. Get a hold of the copy of your soil survey. Um, each county has a soil survey. You can look up a map, an aerial photograph, talk to your soil and water conservation district. They can help you put a soil name on each of the management areas on your property. And then if you know that your particular soil where you're working is a Channery silt loam or a Marden soil, then within that soil survey document you can look at the tree species that are common on that soil, and the soil surveys will typically give an indication of growth potential of a particular tree on that soil. So it will compare, and it does that by using site index. It'll say that, and site index is a measure of how tall a tree will be at a given age, usually at 50 years of age. So it may have, so soil type X may have sugar maple having a site index of 65 at age 50, might have white oak as having a site index height of 45 at a particular age, or maybe it's something else. So you can compare and contrast two particular species and what you would expect in growth for those two particular species on that particular soil. So that's much easier to see than it is to describe. So at this point I would say go visit your county soil and water conservation district. There are people there that are trained and very qualified to help you understand how forest growth can respond to soil conditions. Okay, Dave Fritz says, regarding the cutting of competing trees, how can you tell the difference in the understory trees of old slow-growing trees versus young trees growing up? It's a great question. So if you have two trees and one smaller than the other one, which is, are they both pretty much the same age, or are they not? Well, one thing that you can do is try and understand a little bit of the history of the landscape. If it seems to be an old agricultural field, there may be stone walls, there may be remnants of fence rows somewhere on the property. If there's an absence of pit and mound topography, those are all indications of agriculture, probably agriculture dating from the late 1800s or early 1900s. The forest that you're working in that case is probably an even-aged forest, and the trees are of approximately the same age. In that case, the smaller trees are the losers, the ones that have not responded well to the current growing conditions. If you have an area where you have maybe there's been some previous cutting, you have some patches, some small group openings. Some of those trees may have still have a fairly vigorous looking crown. They still have central stem is pointed vertically. Those are younger trees, and those are trees that are still striving to try and attain canopy dominance. On the smaller trees, when that central stem, when the top of the tree starts to flatten out, the tree is essentially giving up its efforts to try and attain canopy dominance, and it's trying to survive by just spreading out horizontally. So those are, you can look to try and sustain those trees that have good central stem that's still growing vertically. Now, that said, you wouldn't necessarily want to cut a large healthy tree that's 12 or 14 or 16 inches in diameter just to favor a 4-inch or a 6-inch tree to work around that. I'll give you some strategies, mostly some people that you can talk to help see how that's happening. Okay, Ralph Johnson points out the use of an increment borer, which is essentially it's a hollow metal drill bit that you can bore in at the base of the tree, and you can get down and bore in, at or near the butt of the log, so you're not going to have a major impact on the value, to show growth rates and to show the ages of those trees. That's a very powerful tool. Those are expensive. It's a very powerful technique. Those are expensive tools, as I'm sure Ralph knows, and others who've bought one. They can run from $150 to $250 or $300 to get a nice increment borer, and that's a great tool. A lot of times when I'm working with landowners, I take tree cookies to show, and I have a nice set of tree cookies where I have 2 sugar maples. They're both about 6 inches, but of very different ages, just to illustrate the point that age does not necessarily correspond to size. Now that doesn't help when you're looking at one particular tree, but it does get the point across. Okay, Bob says, well, you can read it and I'll read it too. Yes, okay. So Bob's actually responding back to Ralph. Robert says, what about standing dead trees and blowdowns? 2 responses to that. Bob has one, not if you need snags for wildlife purposes, but by the same token, those standing dead trees and snags can be potential hazards. And we're going to be talking about Directional Felling and a program called The Game of Logging here in just a slide or two. To answer that question specifically, I would encourage someone who's felling a tree next to a tree that's potentially hazardous to the person running the chainsaw to deal with that hazard tree first. So or if it's a tree that's of significant wildlife value and you don't want to take it down, then reassess the need to cut the tree that you think you're going to cut. So let me keep moving on here. So these previous slides have dealt with the kind of the principles that you use when you want to decide which trees to cut and which trees to leave. We've talked about crown position. We've talked about the vigor of the crown. We've talked about the species, some of the species that are matching species to soils, some of the safety issues. Now what I want to talk about is a process called crop tree management. And if you do a Google search for the words crop tree management, you'll have a month or more of reading on this topic. So we're going to spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes talking about crop tree management. But I think it'll give you the sense of what's going on. What you're trying to do is essentially use a garden approach to forest management. And the garden approach that I'm talking about is when you're growing tomatoes, you have a certain spacing, or you're growing cabbages, or you're growing carrots. You either control the initial spacing, or after the garden plants are established, you go in and you remove the less desirable plants, and that's less desirable relative to whatever gardening objective is, to provide the more desirable plants the freedom that they need, crown space that they need to grow and develop. So the way this works, and we'll use this little schematic showing our crop tree in the middle, and this is an aerial or downward view of this crop tree. Before we talk about the 4 different quadrants of the crop tree, let's answer the question, what makes a good crop tree? Well, a good crop tree is a crop tree that supports your ownership objectives. So it may be, if you're interested in saw timber, it may be a black cherry or a red oak or a white oak or a sugar maple or a red maple. If you're interested in wildlife trees, it may be a red oak or a black cherry, or red maple, or you decide what species is a good crop tree based on your objectives. And the other 2 characteristics are that the crop tree should have a dominant or codominant crown position, and that the tree should have enough vigor that it's going to live for another 10 or 15 years. So that's what makes a good crop tree. Then you walk through your forest, and I recommend using flagging tape. And with that flagging tape, and I use the blue color ribbon to mark the crop trees, the blue ribbon trees, and you get a sense of what you have to work with. And because what you're working with is the best of what you have. It's not necessarily, you're not working with the trees that you wish you had, you're working with the trees that are currently growing in that particular part of your forest. After you've marked your crop trees, then you go and you stand next to, and I end up spending a lot of time walking around the perimeter of my crop tree and saying, if I have 4 quadrants on this crop tree, which of those quadrants are in competition? So, and then from that, you would just mentally note, as the tree in this picture shows, it has a free to grow rating of 0. So it has 0 sides are free to grow. Then you would mark those trees, as I've done this light pale color green. Those are the trees that are competing with our crop tree, and you cut those trees. At this point, this tree now has a free to grow rating of 4, which means that all 4 sides of the tree are free to grow. This is going to maximize the growth on this tree. At the same time that you've done that, the benefit of this is that the trees that are near your crop tree also have increased their free to grow rating. So the tree in the upper left-hand corner that now has a free to grow rating of 2 was completely closed canopy. The tree in the lower left-hand corner also had an increase from a free to grow rating of 0 up to 1. So even though your focus is on this particular tree, you've benefited nearby trees. Now, oftentimes you'll have two adjacent trees that you recognize as crop trees. It's okay to treat those two trees as one contiguous crown and then free area, release the area all around this crown. Cursor, so the area around these two crowns together would be released. Temptation that you want to avoid is ultimately making a hard decision, and I do this myself. I'll admit sometimes you go out there and you think every tree you look at is a crop tree, and you have to stop yourself and say, now wait, what I need to do is provide sunlight. Sunlight's the limiting resource, and if we don't provide the sunlight, then we're not going to have the growth that we want. If you're really eager, you can do a high intensity crop release where you go and you do a four-sided release, or essentially a four-sided release on all the trees in your forest. This is the advantage of using the flagging tape or the marking ribbon, because you can mark these trees. You can put a blue ribbon on each of your crop trees, and you can put a red ribbon or an orange ribbon on the trees you're going to cut. And then you can look at it and you can make some early assessments as to whether or not you want to have that aggressive of a cut. There are some people that just absolutely don't want to have that much cutting done, and that's fine. That's part of their ownership objective, and they can scale back. So if you don't want a high intensity cut, you have two options to scale back. One option is that you just recognize fewer crop trees. So instead of recognizing 50 crop trees per acre, maybe you recognize 12 or 15 crop trees per acre, and then you can do a full four-sided release on those trees. The second strategy is that you can maybe recognize the full 50 crop trees and release, instead of doing a four-sided release, you do a one or a two-sided release, and just release that side of the tree that is most constrained in its growth. So what are some of the positive effects that we can expect from thinning? Here are some general trends. We're going to get the best growth response on a high-quality site, good soils, good soil drainage, best response from trees that are between 50 and 85 years of age. Well, actually, I'd probably drop that 50 down to something younger, down into maybe the 35 or 40-year age class, and if those residual trees were healthy to begin with. The research that's been done in thinning and hardwood response to thinning shows that you can have anywhere from a 30 to a 50% increase in growth, and that growth is measured in a variety of different measures, either cord volume per acre, board foot volume per year, and at the same time you're going to have an increase in the quality of the stem, so that the log grade increase, because as the tree is growing faster, it's growing over some of those blemishes. There'll be reduced mortality, because if you do your selections correctly, you're going to be reducing the trees that are most likely to die, so just by definition you should be reducing mortality. And if you work with young trees, you can actually improve the live crown ratio. So as you've probably seen in your forest, as a tree grows, the lower side of the crown, the leafy portion of the tree, that usually just that lower edge usually just creeps up the stem. By thinning, you can add sunlight, you can infuse sunlight to the full depth of that crown, so as the tree grows taller, it's actually the percentage of the total height of the stem that has live crown will actually increase. Diameter response is going to vary anywhere from 2 to 5 years depending upon species. There's different schools of thought and different research evidence that addresses whether or not the diameter of the tree will predict its potential response. The younger trees, and it's really more of an age than it is a diameter, so the younger trees have a greater potential to respond. Trees that have a healthy crown have a better potential to respond. And the response does depend on the intensity of the cut. The more sunlight you provide, better response, better growth rate response you're going to get. Some of the cautions, some of the things to worry about, deal with potential for an increase in the formation of epicormic sprouts. These are the water sprouts that can form on a tree. Some previous research has shown an increase in epicormics, and then more recent research indicated that that had relatively little effect on the quality of the butt log. The other consideration with epicormics, the formation of epicormics, if you're releasing dominant and codominant trees, those have less reduced likelihood of forming epicormics, reducing the intermediate and suppressed trees that you're more likely to have epicormic formations. Thinning usually doesn't have a strong effect on height growth, and it may have a very poor effect on the release of low canopy trees, those sub-canopy trees. Okay, directional felling. Oh, let me give one other caution, if you will. If your forest is located on thin soils, soils that are poorly drained, very rocky soils, if the trees are not well rooted, aggressive thinning can open up the forest enough to allow air circulation and air turbulence that can knock over some of your crop trees. So if you're working, and this is another good question to talk with your soil and water conservation specialist, is are these soils thin? Are the trees prone to wind throw? If they are prone to wind throw, you want to take a much more conservative approach to thinning. Be thin, make fewer and smaller canopy openings. Okay, directional felling. We've talked about this a little bit with the game of logging. Directional felling, I'll offer a definition here, is where you decide the direction a tree falls. When any of us can go out and cut down a tree, and it's going to fall at least a little bit until it either falls all the way or it gets hung up on a neighboring tree. But the beauty of directional felling is that we can actually influence the direction that a tree falls. We can influence it to the point that we can take a tree that's leaning in one direction and gravity says it's going to fall in one direction, and using correct technique we can make that tree fall in a different direction. The best, and I think most, what I recommend is the best way to learn directional felling is to participate in a course called Game of Logging, and this has been redesigned for landowners. These courses are offered, I heard of them being offered throughout most of the United States. I'm sure that there are areas where they're more or less available. We offer them in New York through the University Arnott Forest. You go to the forestconnect.info website, we now have a hot button that can take you to the game of logging. Some of the advantages of directional felling: you reduce the frequency of hung trees. When you do hang up a tree, you can safely and quickly release that hung tree. You can better position the log for extraction by your tractor or however you're going to move the log, reduce the likelihood of personal injury, to increase productivity. I'll just point out these are pictures from some of our training sessions. This is our local certified game of logging instructor, Bill Lindloff, and this is a student, a participant in game of logging, a female landowner who had never touched a chainsaw. She bought her chainsaw on eBay, brought it to the game of logging training in a box. Instructor Bill Lindloff has helped her assemble the saw, and then by the end of the day she felled this looks about an 11-inch beech tree. So it's a beech tree, and was able to use directional felling, and she hit the stake, or almost hit the stake. That was her target. So you can imagine, having started with never having touched a chainsaw in your life, and then leaving, it's a long 8 or 10 hour day-long course, but by the end of the day when you've left, you've cut your own tree under the tutelage of the instructor, and then at the end of after each tree is cut, the whole class of 10 students will gather together and evaluate the cutting process. So by the end of the day, you really feel like you've cut 10 trees. So let me back up here to a question. Whit Spalding asked, if you prune epicormics, will they come back? I'm not sure about that. I think that if you cut those epicormics and clean them up about within a year or two of them forming, you can probably, the likelihood of them coming back will be relatively slim. The reason why the epicormics form largely is because of redistribution of hormones, and when in a forest, provide sunlight to the crown of the tree that it wasn't quite ready for, or it wasn't accustomed to, is a better way to state that. So after the thinning, within a year or two, the tree has figured out kind of which way is up, if you will, and if you prune off those epicormics, my guess is they would not come back. Okay, a common question when we think about how we deal with some of the trees that we want to deal with. The slide on directional felling, and here on girdling the tree, how do we handle the trees that we want to kill? Girdling is a common question. The advantage of girdling, you can see what happens with girdling, is you just take a chainsaw and you ring the tree. You just need to go about 1/4 of an inch into the tree, just a little bit past the bark, the inner bark of the tree, and sever the connection between the roots and the crown. By doing that, it's very quick. You can accomplish this, especially if you're in a dense forest. You can kill the tree. You can be done with the tree in a shorter amount of time than if you're trying to cut it. The downside is that these trees will invariably die. It may take 2 years. I've seen some girdled trees that are still alive after 3 or 4 years. It may take a long period of time for those trees to actually die. So the growth response of the residual trees will be delayed. Also, when the trees die, you don't know how they're going to fall or if they're going to fall. If they don't fall, that's actually a pretty good thing because they remain a standing snag. We've had other trees, though, that have been girdled, and then you come back 3 or 4 years later, and the girdled tree has fallen against the crop tree and is caused damage to the crop tree. So my usual response to the question of should you girdle is, one answer depends a bit on location. You should never girdle in areas next to trails, next to camping spots, next to buildings and things like that, because when the tree falls, you don't know when it's going to fall, and in human use areas, you want to be particularly sensitive to safety issues. In general, I would say you're probably better off taking a course in directional felling and learning how to cut trees correctly and safely and putting those trees on the ground. If you want to create wildlife snags, you can do that judiciously by picking a few trees, 3 trees or 7 trees per acre that you do girdle, and position them in places where when they do fall, they're not going to do damage to crop trees. Okay, some other ways to do essentially to girdle. And these would be with smaller trees. This is a current research project, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly. This is a flame weeding project where you use a flame wand, as we see here. This was some of our early work. I just took the tank from my barbecue grill and connected it up, and more recently I've purchased a 10-pound cylinder and put it onto a backpack, and we can use that to kill girdle trees like buckthorn and striped maple, barberry, and so forth. For herbicide treatments, I'll direct you to cut stump. Herbicides are another way to kill trees. Effectively used. There's a good publication from the Forest Service that I have, cut stump treatments. If you go to my Forest Connect website and go to miscellaneous, to publications and then miscellaneous, there's also a really good publication from Penn State on the use of herbicides in forests. This is a PDF. I think what I will do is paste this, rather than put you into the, send you to that. I'll do that at the end, but I'll paste this into the chat pod, and you can select that and copy it yourself. So it's a really good discussion of how to use pesticides in the forest. Okay, another comment: when you fell the trees, give strong consideration to maybe just leaving the trees rot in the forest. It's a great source of organic debris. The wildlife benefit from it. And what it does is it saves damage to the residual trees. You know, when some people look at this particular forest, they think about all of the BTUs that are rotting on the forest floor. If you put an economic value on all those BTUs, you're looking at something measured in the order of the value as that wood sits. Is on the order of $10 or $50. You're not talking about a lot of money. There's extract that wood and put it onto a truck and buy a truckload of firewood logs. Maybe you're spending $600 for that truckload, but there's a lot of value added to those. From your perspective as the owner, taking out this particular tree, and that tree might be 10 inches, and if it's a 10-inch tree, it might have a tenth of a cord or a quarter of a cord of firewood. The value of that tree is $1 or $2. And if in the process of dragging out that tree, you skin up your crop tree, you're further behind than you are further ahead. So the ultimate question is, should you thin? Some of the things that you would look for, we hinted at this a little bit, is should you thin if you have a closed canopy, irregular crowns, dead lower branches, the absence of an understory, slow growth, disease, and defect. You should not thin, or you should be very prudent about your thinning if you have shallow-rooted trees on thin soils, or if you already see some daylight. Starting place is contact your state agency forester for a free visit. State agency forester come out to your property, your tax dollars at work, and talk with you about what your appropriate stocking is, what your density is, what other kinds of issues you have. You can flag some trees in advance that you think you can use to have to start a discussion with that forester, and they will assess what you've done and help point you in the right direction. If you want to have commercial help, if you want to have maybe have a firewood sale or a commercial harvest of low grade, your agency forester can provide you with a list of private sector foresters. I'll also refer you to the July 2007 webcast, which was an hour-long presentation on selecting a forester. Then our last slide, I'll put this up. This is just a list of publications. Some of these are specific to New York. So just look at these, and while you're formulating your questions, let me bring up our final poll. If I could get you to respond to this, please. And at the same time, if you have questions, please go ahead and start typing in your questions. I'd like to, so I'm asking you to do two things at once. Think of a question, but also respond to this survey poll. And then it's 1 o'clock or a couple minutes after. I'll have time. We'll stick around for a while and answer whatever questions you might have. I also have, while you're doing that, we have 37 people have signed in or have registered here. We get a few more of you to sign in. I've added Jay Aaron and Ron Farr to the list of foresters. If there are any other foresters, please put a note into the chat pod that you're a certified forester or a licensed forester so that I can make sure I record your participation. And if you're a licensed forester in the states of Connecticut and Maine, if you send me an email to PJS23, I'll put it in. You send me an email at PJS23 and ask for email confirmation of your participation. I'm happy to do that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and hide that, and then I'll bring the chat pod over, and well, I'll leave it off to the side. But if you have questions, please feel free to sound in with any questions. I did have a question earlier in the day that I'll respond to here. The question was, if you have two trees, essentially two trees side by side, two saw timber sized trees, and one of them has, maybe there's a difference in grade. You have the bigger tree might be a slightly better grade, and the smaller tree is perhaps a lesser grade. Is there ever value in cutting, or what's the economic justification, or is there an economic justification for cutting the smaller tree? Typically, the answer to that is no. If just a simple answer, although you'd of course look at each situation independently. The reason for the generalized no answer is that you would probably not recover in added growth what you would lose in the loss of that future saw timber tree. So if you have a tree, let's say it's 10 inches, 12 inches, it's going to be a saw timber tree. By cutting that 10 or 12 inch tree, if it's a decent tree, your lost future value is not going to be recovered by added growth of the tree it's next to. So I don't see any questions. Maybe either my microphone isn't working or there are no questions. Okay. Is it possible to obtain a soil survey map for your forest land from the County Soil and Water Conservation District? Yes. In some, thank you, Bob. I'll just a tangent here. It must be like the people on the radio. You think, is anybody actually listening out there? It is possible to get a soil survey map. It is, in some cases, you can find soils information on the internet. I would start, if you want to do that, I would start with that NRCS website I brought up for you earlier, or make a visit to your county soil and water conservation district and schedule some time to spend an hour in the office with the district conservationist, or have a soil and water staff person come out to your property and walk around your property. These people have a wealth of experience that they can bring to this. There are also a lot of foresters that have a good soils background. Okay, there we're getting sparked some questions. So let me open these up so that we can see them. Increase the text size so I can read them a little bit better. Okay, so George says, I have a 10-year-old red pine plantation on close centers. Should they be thin now? The answer to that's probably yes. The thing to look for is if you're getting some crown, if the lower portions of the crown are starting to thin, or if the lower portions of the crown, the tree branches are starting to die, then yes, you should. If you wait too long on some of those trees, they'll continue, on some of those pine plantations. I've seen the plantations where they'll continue to grow. There will be some natural mortality, but with that natural mortality, you're not controlling the trees that win and lose. You're just kind of dealing with the trees that win and lose. I would start with get a public agency forester to come out. There are what are called stocking charts for pine that can be used to determine the number of trees that should be present based for optimal growth based on the average diameter of the trees. Okay, Ray says, how do you address skid trail placement, the spacing, and a crop tree prescription? I would work with skid trails. Usually we space our skid trails to try and have less than 8% of the land area allocated to skid trails. So if you have depends on what you're going to be skidding with. If you're using a small farm tractor, you can have different kind of skid trail placement than if you're working with commercial sized 10-foot or 12-foot wide pieces of equipment. The skid trail placement is part of the question. You want to put those skid trails in some kind of a herringbone or or other kind of pattern so that you have access to your whole property. You want the skid trails to have ideally less than a 10% grade for any length of stretch, although in very short spans they can grow. Very short spans, you can go for a greater grade than a 10% grade. And put those in and then work your crop trees around them. The skid trails are best when they're straight, because when they're not straight, then you have a bumper tree on the corner, and bumper trees eventually wear out, and so over time you'll end up with a straight skid trail. If you're doing all the skidding and you're willing to cut your logs in 8-foot and 10-foot and 16-foot lengths to move them out, you can have more curve. But if you're working with a commercial operator, and especially if you're not willing to have a contract constraint that prohibits tree length or log length skidding, the straighter the skid trail, the better off you're going to be in the long run. Okay. Okay, let me, I got a question here. I'm going to reconnect you all to the NRCS website. So that'll open that up in your internet browser. Okay, the question is about the flame weeding method. How effective is it, and where do you get more information? We're currently doing research. Cornell University is doing research, and the University of Connecticut's doing research. We're doing this relative to invasive shrubs and undesirable understory trees. It has some advantages and some disadvantages. There's not currently a lot of information on flame weeding in forestry applications. There's not a fact sheet because we're still basically in the research phase of this. If folks are interested, you see my email here is my cursor is not going to show up towards the top, the PJS23 at Cornell. You send me an email if you're interested in this. I can send you a fairly short, can't really send you specifications on it because we don't have the protocols worked out, but I can send you a list of some of the providers of this equipment. Okay, Doug says, are there some sugar maple trees with maple borers that are in fact healthy, or maple borer is always the kiss of death? Sugar maple trees will try to recover from the damage that's caused by maple borers. And you will, if it's a relatively minor infestation of a particular tree, there just may be one individual wound associated with that maple borer, and if it's relatively small, the tree will try to and may eventually grow over that. And as it adds more wood and becomes increasingly bigger in diameter, the strength of the tree will increase. The real concern, the two things to think about are, when you look at this tree, are there multiple locations on that tree where you have the maple borer? Then it has a greater likelihood of structural failure. Another thing is the size of the tree when the wound happened. The defect is going to be there, and so you may add new wood over that tree, and it may become increasingly structurally vigorous, but you're still going to have a defective log. So, the other way to think about that is, is there a better tree adjacent to this sugar maple tree with the sugar maple borer that I would be better off providing the growing space to? Sugar maple borers are very closely associated with overstocked stands. Okay, Tim says, number of white birch overtopped by white pine. Is it time? The birch. Paper birch or white birch is a tree that is very intolerant of shade. If you don't need to remove the birch, I guess it depends on what your ownership objectives are. The paper birch will not survive in the shade for very long of another tree. The eastern white pine can attain much greater height typically than paper birch. And so I'm not, whether or not it's time to remove the birch depends upon your objectives. But the birch, if it's in the shade, the birch is going to die. Okay, Dave says, please repeat the web soil survey web link. Okay, I'll open that up again. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking this in. Let me paste this in as well. So here's the website. If you go to websoilsurvey.nrcs.usda.gov/app. Okay, Dave wants to know if Arlen Perky's field guide and crop tree reference release is good. Yes, absolutely. It's very good, and I would refer you to that. There are several publications on the crop tree release. One of them, as I recall, and it may be out of print, although I suspect it's still available online, is about I'll say a 35 to 50 page bulletin on how to apply crop tree management. And if you're going to do crop tree management, that's a great resource to download, to read through. And he has a very deliberate series of steps that you would follow going out into the forest, doing an inventory, a check of the forest, and um, and assessing your crop trees, things like that. So yes, Arlen Perky is great. Okay, the matching the trees to the soils. I just connected your browsers to that. There's the gmushrooms.com. Okay, that was Bruce. Bill O'Neill. Epicormics contributes sap production in sugar maples. Probably. The epicormics, when they form they form a leaf, and and that leaf is going to do some photosynthesizing. The more foliage and the more photosynthesis the sugar maple trees have, the better their sugar concentration of the sap. Some of those epicormics, and my worry with the epicormics is sometimes it's a fairly weak junction of the branch to the stem, and so it may not, in the long run, it may not be good for the tree to have. Okay, Mike, yes, correct. We're going to have a flame weeding demonstration at the Genesee County Park, which is west of Rochester. I'll say an hour, maybe 45 minutes west of Rochester, New York, on the 4th of October. It's the first Saturday of October. This is a effort that's coordinated out of my office in cooperation with the New York Forest Owners Association. We'll have a flame weeding torch there. We did some flaming, a research plot of American beech, and I was also on Monday, I was at the same location and setting up an herbicide cut stump herbicide demonstration to control American beech. We're going to do this. I suspect in the next year, this is part of an integrated research and extension effort, we'll be having several flame weeding demonstration efforts, almost always in cooperation with the New York Forest Owners Association. So for those of you that are in New York, if you're not a member of NIFOA, it would be a good idea to become a member of the New York Forest Owners Association. If you're in a different state, you should join whatever state you're in, your Forest Owner Association. Hey, Wood asks a great question. If you're leaving defective loser trees in the forest floor, victims of pathogens, are they more likely to spread their pathogens to your crop trees? You're leaving a source of inoculum, though, as those trees start to degrade. The pathogens that depend upon a living host are no longer going to survive. The pathogens that survive on a dead host, the saprophytes, are probably already present in your forest. So there are a couple of pests that you need to worry about. One of them is the fusarium canker. I showed a picture of that earlier. And another one, for example, with black cherry, is the peach bark beetle. Those are two where you do need to be fairly sensitive to leaving infected material in the wood. Most of the rest of them, the maple borer, Utapella canker, Nectria canker, those are sufficiently common in the forest that not really worth. I mean, you can take them out for firewood. They're also fine if you can do it carefully, mind you. But it's also okay to leave those in the forest. So Jim asked, do epicormics from bird's eye patterns in maple? Not to my knowledge. That would be nice if they did. So I see we have at least one more question maybe coming in. All right, well, thank you all. I'm going to turn off the recording, and I'll have this presentation posted to my website in the next day or so. I appreciate your signing in, and it's going to be the same live presentation tonight at 7 o'clock, but you're quite welcome to come back if you have nothing else to do. Enjoy the sunshine, enjoy your day, and by all means, please be safe when you're working in the woods.